All right, we're back. Chapter 3, and we left off with the Columbian encounter. And what I want to get back to is we talked about all the different things that were exchanged, is the diseases. The diseases specifically that were brought over and devastated the Americas. Here's an example. In Mexico, specifically the area around Mexico City, prior to the Europeans coming in the 1500s, the population we estimate was close to 23, 25 million people. Um, The first outbreak of smallpox occurs in 1520, not long after Europeans first come to trade with Native Americans, and this causes 8 million people to die. And you can see right here we drop. In 1545, another outbreak of disease, and in 1576, and so by the year 1600, in 100 years, the population drops from 22 million to less than 1 million. In other words, that's a 98% death rate. And this wasn't unique to just Mexico. Native American populations, wherever Europeans encountered them, within 100 years would collapse dramatically. It's one of the largest pandemics ever recorded in human history. We're seeing populations drop, not just get sick, but die over 90%. How does that play out? Um, for those of you who like Thanksgiving in November, right? Thanksgiving in America, we talk about the pilgrims who came from England, who lived in Massachusetts, barely survived, but gave a dinner with their Native American neighbors to give thanks for making it through the year. When the Plymouth colony, where the Pilgrims landed, was founded, the Pilgrims came here to settle in the middle of December, middle of winter. Not very smart. What are you going to do for food, right? There were no grocery stores. Well, they came to this area and they found this empty land, an abandoned Indian village. It was there, but nobody was there. They were all gone. And not only that, there were fields that had not been planted, but they were cleared. So they built their colony right next to it. The land was cleared. The farm fields were already there. All the trees had been cut down. They were starving. They went into the Indian village and they found these burial mounds where the Native Americans had buried their dead, along with offerings of corn and grain. And they ate the corn and the grain, and there's some reports they ate some of the dead bodies. They starving. They ate what they had to eat. But here's the moral of that story. They founded their first colony because there was already a city here that was empty. Why was it empty? Because 2 years earlier, a pandemic of disease, we think cholera, had gone up and down the east coast of the United States. Native Americans had traded with British on the coast. The disease started at some small little meeting and spread up and down, and the village, basically everyone died about 2 years earlier. And those that didn't die, there were so few left, they just basically started scattering. And this is something that's been repeated throughout American history. The devastation from diseases like smallpox, which we don't know about now because we've managed, but measles, influenza. Native Americans had never had measles. They had no natural immunity. They had no idea. And we think at least 90% of the people in North and South America within 200 years of contact died. This leads to this idea, the myth that America was a wilderness to be settled. In colonial times, there was this idea that it was okay for the British to come here and settle because the land was wide open. There was no one there. It was a wilderness. Well, it was a wilderness because 100 years earlier it had been full of people, Native Americans, and now they were all gone. Whenever they would come into an area, there were very few natives left. Another example of that is the expedition of Hernando de Soto. He was the first European to explore or go through this area of the North America, which is Florida, Georgia, the southeast. He lands here in Florida in 1539 with several hundred men on horseback, and they also brought with them for food a pack of pigs that would walk alongside them. And then, as needed, the pigs could be slaughtered and eaten, but they would eat the grass along the way. Well, as he did this trip, he came across all these Indian villages, Native Americans. Some of them were quite large, but he was always within sight of people. It was very densely settled, they noted. Along the way, some of the pigs got out. They broke loose. Well, one thing that happened was these pigs carry diseases. We think that influenza actually originally started in pigs hundreds of years ago. And so these pigs interact, they get loose, and they interact with people. And what happens is, 100 years later, when the next European comes through, there's nobody here. All the villages are empty. They're gone, abandoned. And they didn't know why. We think what happened was, in the wake of DeSoto coming through and trading and talking with these Native Americans, the diseases followed. The Native Americans speak of the Great Dying, where many people died off of illness. And again, remember, they had no knowledge of the disease. They didn't know what caused it. For many, they thought it was a sign from God, right? If you don't have that knowledge, it decimates these cultures. So much so that when this area was settled, the idea was, well, this was open land anyway. We're not taking it from anybody. So another thing that can decline climate is climate change. And I'm not talking about just what's happening now. There have been climatic swings throughout history, but that affects agriculture, right? If you grow a crop that needs lots of water, but all of a sudden the climate changes and there's not as much rain, you're not going to grow as much corn, that's going to have some severe effects. Especially, right, as we go back in history. Right now, if something was to happen and a drought happens in the United States and we can't grow as much wheat or corn, right, what would happen? Would people starve, or would we just order corn or buy corn somewhere else? That's what we would do. But back then, people didn't have those connections. There was not much transportation as there is now, so people were more reliant on their local food. And if output declined, so did population. In the 1600s, we had a climatic shift called the Little Ice Age. Right around Europe, the temperature drops dramatically for about 50 to 100 years. The winters are far more colder, and there were far more springs where it was too cold to grow, or crops would fail. And so with these food shortages in that era, population decreases by 30%. People are not having children, or they're too sick to have children, or people are dying younger, whatever causes that. But it also caused issues. The English Civil War in the 1660s, the English actually cut off their head of their king and declare a republic for 20 years. This happens in the middle of that. We think that was in large part prodded on by the decline in population. In Asia, the Ming Chinese Empire, which in the year 1600 was the most advanced society on earth and civilization on earth, collapses. And in large part due to famine. People were starving in the streets, right? If you think of how people reacted here, right, when the grocery stores, all of a sudden people couldn't go out and go shopping every day with the COVID, and what happens? The grocery stores are stripped bare. That was nothing compared to what happens here. And so there's an intimate relationship between your climate, your food, and your society. So that's where we were. And we are going to kind of transition now into where we are and may be. But first we have to talk about this idea of reproductive revolution, the way we view reproduction, right? So I'm going to toss out this term patriarchy. And if you don't know what it is, you're probably a guy. Old joke. Patriarchy is basically a society where males are in charge. They are patriarchs. They are the leaders of society. And how is that tied to reproduction? Okay. Well, for most of human history, right, we had high infant mortality. The amount of children that would die before they were able to grow up and have more children was very high. It wasn't uncommon for people in the 1850s to have 10 children and only 5 survived to adulthood. And not only that, those who did survive did not live very long. People got sick more often. We didn't have the medicine to take care of them. They died younger. So for a society to maintain its people, we had to have a lot of children. And if a woman is having a child, that pretty much describes her role, doesn't it? If you as a society need your women to have 10 children so that 5 may survive, right? Then that means that that woman, for the years that she's having children, is pretty much a mother and really not else. Okay? So that gives men the upper hand because women have to stay home and take care of the children, right? Men could have helped out, not saying they couldn't, but it definitely, keeps that in line. Many cultures have this, or many religions have this kind of, idea that, women are the mother that go forth and populate the world, but women are the mothers of man, and they are. But that also ties in large part to the fact that we needed that. What we are seeing now is the demographic transition. In other words, reproduction is much more efficient. My father, born in 1940, had 14 brothers and sisters. I was born in the 70s. I have 2 brothers and sisters. Many of you who are born in this new century maybe only have one or two, or maybe even no brothers or sisters. We're having smaller families. And why is that? Well, we have much more effective reproduction. People are living longer. Most children do not die in infancy. And so you don't have to have 10 children per person to be productive, to create society. And what happens is if women are having less children, that gives them the opportunity for other roles. In other words, they don't have to be just the mothers of society. And so if that is the case, then that challenges this whole idea of patriarchy. Because at least if patriarchy, you can actually make the argument that, if you need women to be mothers, then if they're going to be the people taking care of the children and the mothers, that's what fathers do. This just says, well, then there is no excuse for that. And not that I'm saying there was, but this just is a whole question. And this is where we're at. And before I end, what we're talking about here is the demographic transition, the way populations are created. And what it is this. We are seeing declines in mortality rates. People are dying less often. What that means is people are living longer, they're healthier. So the amount of people dying is getting smaller, which means people are living longer. And as that happens, because people aren't dying as much, people are having less children. So here's an example of the demographic transition. In this society, let's just say the society is 1800. You have a lot of people. For every one woman is having 5 kids, right? So you have a high birth rate. But a lot of people are dying as well. But over time, through advancements in technology and medicine and society, people start dying at a lesser rate. So what happens is populations grow. But eventually, because we don't need as many people to replace who are there, people begin to have less children. And so eventually what will happen is that populations begin to shrink. And we're seeing that right now. But that leads to uneven replacement rates. So I'm going to pause right here, and we're going to explore this concept in detail in the next couple sections.